The last function of the kidney that we really have to consider is acid-base balance of the blood. You may remember that the pH of the blood should be between 7.35 to 7.45, and one of the kidney's jobs is to keep us in that range. So I just wrote that here. The pH has to be kept there, and the respiratory system and the renal system will both work towards keeping us there. Acidosis is any pH below 7.35. And it doesn't matter how it happens or why it happens, but if you fall below 7.35, you are in acidosis. Likewise, any pH above 7.45 is called alkalosis. And it doesn't matter how you got there, it's just that you have a high pH. So, what are the two types of acidosis? We have metabolic acidosis, where the metabolism or ketones or lactic acid or other metabolism sources of hydrogen are in excess. So we see diabetic ketoacidosis. We see people on the ketogenic diet as being very common. Lactic acid can cause a temporary metabolic acidosis if you've done a lot of anaerobic exercise. If you do it continuously, you'll be in a state of acidosis. Respiratory acidosis, on the other hand, is any condition that prevents the normal removal of CO2 when you're breathing, such that it builds up in the blood. And I say any condition: emphysema, COPD, congestive bronchitis, chronic bronchitis, pneumonia, anything that keeps you from breathing CO2 out, even asthma, can cause a respiratory acidosis. So we have to be very careful with the respiratory system. So if you are in metabolic acidosis, the respiratory system has what we call the short-term fast correction for respiratory compensation. And if you are metabolic acidosis, you will breathe more. You will breathe more deeply. Remember that the second layer of the drive to breathe is all about hydrogen ion. And therefore, if you have a high hydrogen ion, you'll breathe out the CO2 to pull the equation to the left, as I've indicated with the big red arrow. And that respiration removal of the CO2 will bring us closer to the normal pH. If somebody is in respiratory acidosis, they will have a pH of less than 7.35, but their blood CO2 will be less than that 2600 of the normal. If you remember that box I drew about how the normal values of CO2 and oxygen are, it won't affect the blood oxygen at all. That's the key here, is that removing the CO2 does not affect the oxygen. We don't get more oxygen. You can't have more than 100%. But we will see this increase in breathing. Now, if somebody has respiratory acidosis, you cannot change the breathing to fix it, because if you could, you would have it, you wouldn't be in respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is a different problem entirely. So instead, we have renal compensation for acidosis. The kidney is what we call the slow or long-term corrector for acidosis. We get hydrogen secretion. We're going to increase that, and we're going to increase the recovery of the bicarbonate. We will secrete phosphate as a buffer so that we can secrete even more hydrogen, and we will secrete ammonia as a buffer. So the kidney is a long-term, slow corrector for acidosis, but it is going to be more permanent in its effects.